Okay, great. So thanks everyone for this time and opportunity to speak with you all. It's still really early here in China, so pardon me if some of the thoughts doesn't go really flowy through, but I'm really happy to be here. And as the introduction says, I'm Xiaoyuan Charlene Ren from MyH2O Water Information Network. And today I'm really here to talk to you about the rural waters of China. But before I get into the rural aspect of it, to begin with, I'm curious, like what comes to mind when you really think of water? It's probably like something in the picture. It's something pure and clean that's coming out of a faucet, or it's like something that comes out of a bottle, right? But for me, the first experience that I have like in closer contact with water always goes back to the first time that I was in high school during an extracurricular event. And I actually worked together to work with my team to collect water from a river and tested the water and really learn about all the parameters that are associated with contaminated water. And at that moment, I was really fascinated by all the interesting things that seemingly transparent water can contain. Some of those are harmful, some of those are neutral. And you also get to understand the strong capacity water has to hold these things within it, and also a strong ability for it to heal itself. And this water testing event was part of an initiative at a school club called Roots and Shoots. I bet many of you also know the group because it was founded by Jane Goodall. It was a global NGO. And Jane Goodall is someone who lived a long time in the wild. She spent many of her years with the chimpanzees, living as part of them. And this strong connection with nature, with the wilderness, could lead her to the founding of this organization. And this organization is hoping to empower more and more young children across the world to make voices for nature and for the causes that they care about, to really make sure that they can make voices for the environment around them. And I was really lucky enough to be part of that initiative, to understand our own connection to nature, to the earth as a whole. And so the most grounding moment since I was part of that organization was actually at one of the end of year celebration of the Roots and Shoots extracurricular activity. So I was the leader of the club, and I was trying to buy food for that end of the year event. And I was buying food at 7-Eleven. So I was in a hurry, and without really thinking, I took a bunch of those disposable chopsticks that they were handing out. And when I turned around, I was looking at all of the club members, and they all looked at me with like this great shock, because they feel like, oh my God, you're the president of the club. How can you take anything disposable? It's a shame, all of that information. So I felt really guilty, but at the same time, I was also really happy and relieved in a way, because these were the kids that before they were part of this club, they never really think twice about consumption, what that means to the globe. And now there's this ideology, or there's this new voice of potentially a better shared environmental future, something bigger than, just their own needs, their grades, their desires. And now that voice is planted in their mind. Even though in the future they might not necessarily do anything related to the environment, it's something there. And I knew I was part of that planting process. And it felt like something that I wanted to keep doing and I could potentially do for the rest of my life. And that's exactly what I started to continue to do. From that point on, I did many things revolving around the sustainability and environmental atmosphere. For example, in this picture, I was part of a Haiti movement where we were selling arts from Haiti to raise funds to build water cisterns locally. So we were helping to make voices for the Haitian communities in the mountains that didn't have enough water accessibility. I went on to do research cruises that were studying oil contamination patterns across the Gulf of Mexico. And that was making voices for the contaminated oceans, that people didn't really know what was going to happen to the ocean when the oil spills kept happening, the ocean animals, the ocean atmosphere, and things like that. And finally, during my graduate studies, it took me to the Voices of Rural India. I first studied the wastewater systems of the paper mills, and then went on to an area that I was even more interested in. It's the water and sanitation landscape. At that time, India was still in the midst of that sanitation revolution that started about 2012, a new round of revolution to increase toilet and clean water access across India. So we were able to see all these sort of wall paintings about how do you wash your face, how do you how do you go to the restroom, and please use the restroom, all those information like that. And it was everywhere, and it was really interesting. So I was really eager to learn more about what's happening in India, and is there something that we can do? Are there some stories that we can learn more about to really bring resources to those communities? And interestingly enough, I was able to find this great database that was actually able to provide all that information to us. This database, there was a sanitation database that provided to us the information about every single household, whether or not they have a toilet, whether or not they've learned how to use it, whether the toilet has access to water. And that's every single household. You're able to see that online. It's a database collaborated between the government and the nonprofit sector in India. And then there's another water-related database that documents every single public well in rural India, when the well was built, how much it cost to build that well, what was the water quality tested, was it tested in a lab, was it tested with a field testing kit? You can see some of the samples of data here. And it even also has pictures, right? It has pictures of these villagers standing in front of their toilets, being proud of it. It also have them standing in front of their water wells and things like that. So you actually, through this database, you get to see what's happening in these villages. So I dug a little deeper. For example, in one village that was performing exceedingly well in the sanitation coverage landscape, I actually went to that village and learned about what was happening. And it turns out they had a very interesting practice. They cut down all the shrubs so that people have nowhere to hide when they want to openly defecate. So then they decreases that activity in that way. So we talked to the village leader, and that was the practice that they were using, a very ingenious practice, really interesting. And then there was another village that had a lot of issues with contamination in their water. And when we went to that village, we learned that they have a clean water station, and sometimes the local doctor actually prescribes that water as a treatment when you feel like you have uncomfortableness with your stomach. So water is actually used as a medication in some of these areas, like clean water. So these are the issues that you get to learn through this data system, and then you get to go in a little deeper to really hear more about their voices. And that's also what the local NGOs in India are doing. They're using that database to guide them towards action, like where is more behavioral education is needed, where is some more resources needed, where in what area can we do more research to understand why there are best practices, why some areas aren't performing as good. So that really intrigued me, that data system and the ability of that data system to make the voices and make the stories heard. So I was thinking about then, what about China? What's happening there? And is there a similar information system that tells me more about the situations that are going on there? But I really looked for a lot of these similar databases, but I wasn't really able to find such comprehensive information like that, like the stories that I was able to find in India. So at that time, I really had to go myself into some of these villages to learn what's happening in China. And interestingly, a lot of the situations that face are very similar to India because of the fact that we're both large populations, developing countries with really large populations, and still at the beginning of the developmental stage, like growth stage, right? So for example, in this one village that I visited, it was in rural Gansu, and this lady, she was telling us how in the local area, even though they have pipelines, because the local communities are not willing to pay for the pipelines, so they only provide drinking water about twice every week. And so when the water comes, they will collect all those water really quickly and put them into a water cellar, like the one on the bottom left of the screen. So, so that water cellar, it looks very old. The water that's collected from that cellar is really turbid. You really don't know if it's drinkable or not because they rarely clean that cellar, and the water's been stored there for months, for ages. And so when we asked the lady, like, do you actually drink this water directly? And she says, yeah, like we drink it directly. But she told us, like, I would never give this water to my grandkids. I would always buy bottled water for them. And whenever people come around for the holidays, we would also serve them bottled water because that's something that she thinks they should drink. So she knows that water is better, but she doesn't think that she deserves it. And so at that moment, I realized that for many of these communities in China, even though we don't know where they are, we don't know how to really make their voices heard better. But what we know is that clean water is still an issue. It's a luxury for them. It's a luxury. They feel like it's only servable to the next generation, not for themselves. So these situations we know are still happening, but I'm not able to really locate them well and see them well. And I feel like maybe a lot of young people like me who want to do something for China still can't really see this issue. So I feel like that's an issue and I wanted to do something about that. Unfortunately, I wasn't alone in my desires. So I was able to rally together a bunch of these like girl geeks. So we were from like mapping, data background, water engineering, and so on. We got together from across the world, and we realized that we're ready to go back home now to our hometowns and really make a difference and to really make these voices of the hometowns heard better. And so that led to the founding of my organization called MyH2O. We're aiming to make voices for these villages with clean water and potentially sanitation needs, with the goal to really bring more data-driven clean water solutions to these underprivileged communities and improve their overall health status. And that's sort of the background of the founding of the organization. And then you may ask, like, how do you exactly operate, right? Like, if you make voices, what happens after that? So that's sort of the process that we take, and I'll tell a little bit more about how exactly do we operate. So first of all, in that process, we understand that to really make their voices heard, you have to be connected to the village. And some villagers are more influential than others. There's still like these village opinion leaders or village influencers. So we get connected to them. These sometimes are community organizations or maybe just one person who has a lot of influence. For example, this lady that we talked to, she was a college student that left the village, but then went back to the village to do environmental education work in that village. And so she proposed her own village to us. And the reason that she proposed her village is that this is the situation of the water there. So this is actually a local common well shared in that village. So as you can see, there is this bottle in the well that has punctured holes in it. So you might wonder, like, what does this bottle do? And you might take a guess at that, right? So that bottle is actually acting as a filtration device. So water that's from this well will go through that bottle, filtered by the holes on that bottle, and then goes into the pipeline and then pumped into the villages. So basically this well that can potentially have like pesticide contamination, fertilizer contamination, all sorts of contamination because it's like open, it's like a shallow well, right? And the only thing that's blocking that type of contamination from that well and every single household that are drinking from the tap is that punctured bottle. So that's something that when she gave the picture to us, we were really shocked to hear that. And we knew that this is a village that we want to look more into and see if there's something else, like some infrastructure, education, or cleanup of the well that we can do to serve that community. So that's sort of the work we do initially. We take information from these village partners that we work with and to do initial assessments to understand what the needs are and whether it's useful for it to move on to the next stage. And once it moves on to the next stage, we then connect them with our local student volunteers. So we have a lot of these youth volunteers who are eager to take actions, but they don't really know much about what's happening in the villages. And that's why we need to connect them to these villages. So they would go out in the field, they would use a WeChat app that we have to collect information about the quality of the water, situation of the water, people that they interviewed and what they want, local communities' ability to pay, and information like that. And so we have a network of over hundreds of teams located across China that are able to like go into the field and do these type of field work. And they all have they all have rigorous training before they're able to go into the field because they need to learn how to take data, how to communicate with rural villagers, how to communicate with the rural government, and things like that. And once we get that information, we then map them onto our mapping platform. The map in the background isn't showing up, but it's basically a mapping platform that we put the data on it. So the data showcases where the issues are, what some of the data is showing, and what some of the parameters ranges are. So that information is then coupled together as a package and delivered to our solution provision sponsors. So our solution provision sponsors are then using that information to decide, okay, is this an area that I want to donate in? Is this an area that I feel like I could do something with or do something about? So for example, for the village with the kids in Gansu, we were able to give that information to a local water station sponsor in Beijing. They were also providing water sponsors mostly in times of disaster, but then they also see this as a cause that they're interested in sponsoring and making a social influence name for themselves. So they actually also donated a water station to that community that we just mentioned. So that's the sort of work we do. We get that data and then connect them to the solution providers. But you might also ask us, like, we're also earlier in the stage of designing these solutions. So what exactly does a good solution consist of? If we just land a water purifier, is that enough? But because we've heard tons of stories where, you land a water purifiers and the local community use it, but then when it's time to change the filter devices in that water purifiers, they forget to do that. And so that then as time goes on, that purifier does more harm than good. Or maybe when you donate that to them, the local villager feel like, oh, this is interesting. I don't know if I need this. They might just take it apart and resell the parts. We've seen all those things happening with past cases where donations and solutions have happened. So we really want to dig deeper into how do we make these solutions more sustainable. So we work with the corporation and foundation partners to find the better answer to that. So some of the answers that we find is that, first of all, it really needs to be a sustainable and participatory operations to ensure that whatever solution you deliver can be a long-term solution. For example, in one site in Hebei that we worked with a corporate partner, when we donated the station, we make sure that it was donated to a local group who is going to run and operate it. So in this case, we donated it to a local elderly community group. So this elderly community group are in charge of running the station, and whatever money that comes out of that process, they actually use that money to go back to the operation of that system. And then the extra money actually goes to improving the local infrastructure, improving the pipeline, so that the water can be provided to the local community on a more sustainable basis, increasing the infrastructure wellness of that entire community. So you can see it's a sustainable and participatory operation. The local community decides where the money goes to, and it's a participatory and transparent process. And in addition to that, we also find some other cases where other factors are also important. This is another case that another case, like for example, in this case, we work with a school where the kids are still drinking directly from the faucet without any filtration, not even boiling the water. We're really concerned over their healthiness of drinking that. So it's actually the local headmasters that came to our team and said, I want to build a better water room. So I want purifiers, I want to design the room, I have the manpower to do some of these construction, can you help with the design? So we actually help them connect with a company that are able to do these types of design and reconnection of the pipeline systems to filter the water and to do hand washing facility designs. So we offer them that design, and then the local headmaster with its construction team are actually in the process of doing that construction. So you see there's that component of empowerment. They want that solution. They just need a little technical support. So we were able to do this cross-sector connection to connect them to corporations to help them with that. And then eventually it's still their construction work. It's still their system that they've built. And that's sort of some of the learning experiences that we have with these cases. And that's what we're still doing as we move on. So in the past 5 years, we've had hundreds of teams going to these villages, but we've only started to build these longer term cases in the past 1 or 2 years or so. And we have these 7 long-term sites where we're still continuing to learning from. And in that process, what we really realized is that this is not a work of an NGO, of our NGO alone. It is really work of the community leaders, of the community VOLs, and the corporate partners, the volunteers that are going into the field, and everyone. It's truly a common work that we have to get together all these efforts to make these voices heard and make the solutions delivered into these communities. And that's what we're really hoping for in the future. We're hoping for more collaborative efforts and more people to look into these areas where it was rarely seen before. And together, hopefully, we can make blue the new fashion for these underprivileged communities. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for your speech, Charlene. It was very interesting to hear, and thank you for getting up so early for us. And we appreciate you speaking up for the communities and like resources that maybe can't speak up for themselves as readily. So thank you so much for doing this work. So before we go on to the last slide, We have a couple questions for you. So someone asks, how serious is water pollution in China, both surface and underground? And how do you monitor and detect places with the worst water pollution? I think you kind of touched a little bit on that. And they mentioned the 2015 research conducted by the Chinese Academy of Science, and where some pesticides were 5 to 10 times over the limit. Like where is that data coming from?
Yeah. So yeah, so I've heard about those studies as well, and pesticides, even like hormones that they've tested are able to be detected in that water because of pharmaceuticals that people flush down the river. So those are definitely emerging contaminants that people are very much concerned about. And some of the drinking water facilities, when emerging contaminants happen, they aren't readily available to deal with those because they have like a common protocol through which they treat different common contaminants. But for these new emerging contaminants, unless you do like complete filtration, sometimes they are left out of the treatment process, and that is a concern for a lot of us. But for the work that we specifically do, because the teams that go into the field are like simple volunteer teams. They test for relatively simple parameters. So they're not able to test for anything like very like serious pesticides or like hormones or like pharmaceuticals or things like that. They don't really test for that. They test for more simple parameters like some of the basic metals or some of the parameters like fluoride, hardness, and ammonia, nitrogen, nitrate, and stuff like that. So those are just some basic parameters showcasing whether or not there's agricultural pollution or sanitation issues with the water, or is there like bacteriological contamination. So more of the relatively simple forms of contamination. So those are like the parameters that we look for when we go into the villages. And it really varies from location to location. But I think the strongest concern that people have now are still with shallow groundwater, because shallow groundwater, whatever is happening on the surface, it really gets seeped in very quickly. For the more like more deeper ground wells, those are relatively better protected compared to surface water and shallow groundwater. So in many of these villages, what they're doing now is that they're digging deeper wells and using that well to provide for the village. So they discourage every single household from using their own wells, and they instead build like a community well together. But generally that well doesn't really use any treatment either. It's not like a very centralized water supply. It's more like a decentralized water supply, but it's at least using water from a safer zone in the in like kind of the aquifer, and then gets piped from all the households. And sometimes the villagers, they would buy these chlorination tablets in their own wells, so they would put it in their own water before they drink it, or they still boil it. So boiling is still a common practice. So that's sort of the things we see when people are facing with contamination, and which type of water are facing more sort of contamination. But no, we don't have a very global view, national view of where the most strong contaminants are, because our team is still limited. We only go to the areas where people would tell us that there is an issue. So we only know about more like spots. It's still not pieced together to cover the entire area yet. Yeah.
Yeah, that's good to know. Yeah, data is always very hard to come by. I think you actually touched on one of the other questions about giving villagers kind of advice to how to deal with unsafe water. I think you talked about chlorination, boiling water. Any other thoughts or suggestions on that front?
Yeah, yeah. It also depends on, what's the cause of the problem with the water. Sometimes it's like just, agricultural pollution, and that's something that would take a longer time to really uncover or deal with, right? But then sometimes the villagers are facing industrial pollution. And those are the cases that it's not something that our NGO per se deals with, but I know a lot of other NGOs are dealing with more industrial pollution. So they would actually go to places where the industrial pollution are happening, monitor the point source contaminants and report them, call up the local governments and track their contamination data and make sure that whatever issue is happening is reported. And there's also another NGO that are doing litigation regarding these types of contamination on the soil, on the water, and so on. So different NGOs sort of take different parts of the role in this entire like water contamination landscape, there are a number of NGOs that are specifically targeting how to mitigate the industrial aspect of these issues. And there are some other NGOs like ours or like One Foundation in China that are more targeting on the like the end of the supply, like before you drink it, like when the water is contaminated, what do you do before you drink it? So we're targeting more on that end. Like how do you make sure that you're drinking it safely? How do you make sure you're changing, your filters correctly? Is there some sort of local infrastructure, local filtration system that we can build? Or, if the water is really not a continuous supply, can we build a water tanker to store the water over a long time so that they have a continuous supply? So these are some of the things that we dealt with once the contamination happens. And there's also other group that goes like even further ahead of time to prevent the contamination from even happening. These organizations are people who look through, some new construction environmental evaluation documentation. So, before a factory is built or before a large scale agricultural farm is built, these organizations would go and look through the document to see if there's any violations or any risks that that evaluation doesn't contain. For example, there used to be like sort of this new construction that would cut through a protection region or like a reservoir region. And when they released that document, a lot of NGOs found that to be an issue that is in contradiction with the preservation of that water reservoir. So they would write letters to the government locally and nationally to say that, okay, this is not right? It's against regulations in other areas or on a national level. So they would prevent some of these illegal practices from happening. So before the practice even happens, they're there to work on that. So you can see different NGOs sort of take different things along the pipeline to make sure that from prevention to dealing with it when it happens to preventing it from harming the people, all different aspects of really making sure that this issue can be dealt with in a continuous manner. Yeah.
I think if we explain that, no pun intended for the pipeline metaphor. But yeah, it's great to hear that kind of people are tackling the upstream and downstream. I think we need, as one of our speakers said earlier, we need yes and we need all of the solutions that we can kind of muster together at this time. You mentioned a little bit of the role of government, like NGOs, kind of contacting the government if they find something like not matching regulation. But technically, that should be the government's role to enforce regulation. So, like, what roles and strategies have you seen the Chinese government do to address the water problem?
I think it's a really challenging issue in that aspect. We work more with the local governments, like the village, mostly on the village or the county level, and we also train our volunteers to really effectively talk with the government, because sometimes there isn't really too much like that strong of a trust between the third sector and the governmental sector yet. The third sector in China is still a relatively weak sector, and sometimes the government just don't know who you are, or what your intentions are, what you're doing. So they're really confused about why you're doing this. So you need to have a good way of carrying that message, and that's something we train our volunteer to do when they go into the rural community. So that's something that's really, really important. And on a central level, I think that what we're seeing is there is a push to increase overall infrastructure coverage. So for many of the villages that we visited across the years, we see more and more pipelines reaching more of the villages that used to be on the edge of the system, right? They might not be covered initially, but now they are more and more covered. But the next step of the issue that they're facing is the management of the pipelines. Because as I mentioned in some of the cases that we've seen, even though the pipeline is there, the villagers don't pay at all. Because we've seen a couple of villages where the pipelines are all there, but none of the villages are paid, and the villagers gave up on trying to collect the fees to operate that system. Because I guess the villagers just don't feel like they should be paying for water, which is supposed to be a natural resources that are just clean. And now you have to give us this pipe. It means that our water is unclean. But the reason that the water become unclean is not us. It's like, other type of pollution, right? So they don't feel responsible for the trouble with their own groundwater. So they feel like you have an obligation to provide us with clean water. It's not something we should pay for. But then without that payment, what happens is that the water provision isn't consistent, or the pipelines, when they rupture, it gets fixed very slowly because there isn't like an operational budget for that to happen. So that's the sort of situation we see is the infrastructure and local management. There's like kind of like a break there. So even though whatever the central government is hoping is carrying out in a very uniform way, but when it really gets distributed to each of the villages, the situations are so different, and some of them are not ready yet to effectively manage such a system. So that's why water risks are still happening in many of these locations, because the uniform standard or the uniform way of practice breaks down when it really goes in depth into each of these villages. So so right now, as we collect more of these case information and more of the things that are happening on the ground, we're also compiling case studies, compiling some policy briefs with the hope that whatever knowledge that we have based on our cases can be offered to potentially like a higher up level government, so that better actions can be taken when managing these water pipeline system at a more like village level. So that's something that our entire organization is also hoping to get better at, is how do we communicate our findings to the government to increase their practice or improve their, or help them to understand or maybe give advice to increase that practices at like a higher up level. And that's what many of the nonprofits in China are doing as well, is that they're learning how to talk with the government. They're learning through what channels we can hand in our advice, through what channels we can really improve things at like a higher up level, because that's the situation of the Chinese system, right? It's a big government system. So you have to learn how to work with the government, to talk with them, to give advice to them, to on some ways collaborate and work within the system, so that the voices that you hear isn't just applying to there, it's actually through the central system. It can apply to more and more locations, and things can really be solved at a systematic level. And that's a skill that many NGOs are striving to learn at this point.
Yeah, that's a great perspective. It sounds like that really, that last mile communication and also kind of upward communication, that a lot of work needs to be done. And I guess one of the challenges is probably government communication. Any other kind of big challenges that you faced as you were rolling out your project?
Yeah, I think one thing other is also how do you work with the villages that, like, you know, that you visit, right? Like we work with a lot of these villages, but on some level, like these villagers, they sometimes this is not their priority, right? They know that the water is not right. They know in the long run it's probably not good for their health. If they have children, they're more concerned about the children's health. But if they don't, sometimes they just feel like, oh, you know, whatever. Yeah, like I want more money instead, right? So that level of perspective, or that understanding of what potentially contaminated water or unsafe water does to you, it's not something that immediate registers to them. So that's something that we always call about educating the beneficiaries, right? So sometimes the beneficiaries don't know that this is something that would be helpful for them, because they don't have that mindset. It's similar to what I was researching in India. Like, why do people still openly defecate if they know it's like of high risk? There's a lot of risk for contamination. For women, there's a risk of, like, you know, exposure. So there's a lot of that risk, but why do they still do that? Because you know, there's that like knowledge barrier, knowledge gap, or cultural practices gap there, and sometimes to really go through that gap is also challenging. So that's why in the beginning, we actually went with the villagers. Like villagers report an issue to us, so we go into the village. We work with the villagers directly, but we realize it's really challenging, because when you go into the village, you are an outside force. The villagers don't trust you, right? So they just turn their back on you. They feel like you're a fraud, and they, you know, they don't know who you are. So that's why we started the idea of, like, we have to connect with these opinion leaders, whether it's a local organization or someone who has an influence. We have to do the work through them. We can't just randomly go into a village we think there's a need and like impose anything on them. That's just not how it should be done. It's like challenging, and it's disrespectful, and it's also like really heavy work. So from last year, or like sort of the beginning of this year, we started to really get in contact with more of these local organizations that already have a very strong roots in that community. So we just work with this organization instead. We offer our solutions, we offer our designs, we offer the resources that we have, and then they do all the talking. They work with the government, they make sure the villagers are here, right? If they want that solution, then they make sure that the villagers are acting cooperatively and really knows what it needs to make this thing work, right? So luckily we were able to find more and more of these parties that are interested and has a local influence, so we don't have to be the ones going into that community and doing that influence work, because that is hard work. We are not a very like strong community organization. These community organization does these type of work so much better. So we learned that relatively late because we spent a lot of time doing the work ourselves, and now we learned that we have to look for these leaders. And so that's the challenging part, is how do we identify these leaders? Like, what is a village that doesn't have it? So how do we find these leaders? Where are they? How do we reach them? Because they're not, if they're really deep in the community, it's not as easy to reach, right? So that's sort of the work that we're doing. Like, how do we really effectively reach these communities to begin with, to have these leaders to talk to us and to give us the sites and information so that we can move on in a relatively more scaled and easy way. Because without that, it's going to be really challenging. So that's the part where where we're really aiming for, like scaling, to really scale, is to build that local community support network. And that's something that we're still in the process of learning how to build effectively.
Yeah, it's too bad you can't just search them up on LinkedIn.
Yeah, we do that sometimes. We do it at the state level, because there is like state level charity organizations, and then we call them and say, okay, do you know any community organization? They give us some contact. We call the community organization, do you know any village organization? So we have to trickle down from like that system, and some of the village organizations we're actually able to reach in that way, but it does take some effort to really like kind of pinpoint them. Yeah,
those kind of like 6 degrees of separation concept. I think one last question for you: are you recruiting volunteers, and if people happen to be interested, what can they do to be involved?
Yeah, no, we're definitely recruiting volunteers. We're actually also recruiting international volunteers as well. So if you're interested, there's an email here, and then that's a WeChat account. If you don't have a WeChat account, you probably can't scan that, but you can definitely email message us. And we also have a Facebook page. I can put the link up. If you search for us on Facebook, it's like MyH2O Water Quality. You can find us there, and email us some information. We always look for in terms of international aspect, we always look for volunteers that are helping with international publicity, like updating our LinkedIn and Facebook pages and writing international publicity proposals, because some of the corporate partners, they have international headquarters, so they want our report to be both in English and Chinese. so that would help us to work on that. And as I mentioned, we're also writing up a case handbook that documents all the cases that we're doing, and we're actually writing it up in English, but it is a Chinese team writing it up. So we do need to help with final revisions, touch-ups, and maybe brainstorming ideas of what international agencies we can work with to co-publicize that handbook to make sure that it is used more effectively to a wider audience. So any support with that is definitely really welcome. So just shoot us a message at that email. We'll definitely get back to you, and we can see where to go from there. Thanks.
That's awesome. Thank you so much for sharing, Charlene, and hope maybe you'll find some new volunteers from this event.
Yeah, hopefully.
Yeah, thank you. So that concludes our day today. Thank you. And I want to say a couple kind of final words. Yeah, thank you for sticking with us until the end. We've heard from a lot of diverse group of innovators, thought leaders, change makers, working in a whole bunch of different fields, from like clean water, sustainable agriculture, regenerative leadership, renewable energy, you name it. We've heard their stories, their ideas, their passions, and our question for you is, what is your story? What is your idea and your passion? So we challenge each and every one of you to take the insights that you've learned from these global leaders who have done a lot of interesting and kind of important work, and kind of shared their learnings with you today. And how can you take these insights and apply them to your work? So we hope you're inspired by all of the speeches today and decide to take your own action, and maybe we'll see you apply for this event next year. So you can stay connected with EIN through these codes, so you can scan them, I believe, through